participants on the
Hoo-hoo, I found it.
bottom.
Thanks, Angela. Okay, Michael, I think do you have if you have a presentation, I have allowed the parameters so that you should be able to share your screen.
Great. So that should work. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, well, thank you so much for the introduction and for that conversation beforehand. I think that was really great. Uh, in many ways, Diane, you just set up the my talk so beautifully. There's a couple of slides I can just breeze through now because you've kind of already introduced my study. Um, but yeah, and I was really excited to hear everyone's stories about birding in the pandemic, because that tracks with a lot of the stuff that we thought about and considered when we were putting this project together. So as Diane said, my name is Michael. Call me Michael, and I am the work that I'm going to be talking about today is work that I did during a one-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Manitoba with Dr. Nikki Coper, who normally studies grassland birds. She does field work in Alberta on the grassland bird communities there. Has done a bunch of stuff in the Caribbean as well, in Grenada. Um, but uh, but during the pandemic, she was interested, like me, in doing something. We were stuck in our apartments or in our houses, and so we wanted to use this opportunity as much as we could. And so we were fortunate enough to get the opportunity to do this study. And then, yes, I am sort of my day job, if you want to call it that, is a seabird biologist, and so I have done my master's work and my PhD work on seabirds in various places. I did my master's work out in Washington State in the U.S. on some of the alcids off the coast of Washington and many of the same birds you have in BC. And then did my PhD at Stony Brook University, which is on Long Island, New York. But that was all field work that was being done in the Antarctic, on the Antarctic Peninsula, which I did in with the way we did our field work was in partnership with the many cruise companies that do expedition cruising to the Antarctic Peninsula. So I'm happy to chat about that too, if you'd like. If anyone wants to ask questions at the end, I'm happy to chat a little bit about my Antarctic work. So taking a step away from seabirds during these last couple of years to do this. Anyway, so my new position at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is going to go back to working on some seabird questions and doing some more work in the Antarctic, which I was actually fortunate enough. I just got back from the Antarctic a few weeks ago. My first time going into the field since the pandemic started, which was very exciting. So as I mentioned, this work at the University of Manitoba was it was a large partnership involving a lot of different people, and Nikki Coper was the lead scientist sort of running the thing, but we had lots of help from a whole host of different people all across the US and Canada. Many of these people are at various Canadian institutions. We've got a couple people on this list from the Cornell Lab. They helped us quite a bit in working with the eBird data that we worked with. So lots of cool things, and all supported by NSERC, so money from you all, ultimately. And so this is one of the things we've already had so many stories about what it was like during the pandemic. But if you think back to those initial lockdowns, I'm talking the spring of 2020, when everything shut down before we had I guess Nova Scotia was quite a bit different than many of the other places around North America, but in many places it was that first initial period where the lockdowns were super severe, and then since then we've gotten a little bit more used to working during the pandemic, and some of the traffic and whatnot has returned a little bit to normal, even if we have other things like mask policies and other policies designed to keep us safe. But certainly during that first period, March, April, May of 2020, we saw really dramatic scenes of cities that were normally bustling with activity that were completely shut down. And we've already talked a little bit about the stories that people said. People started seeing things they hadn't seen before. And that was really our motivation. What is, are people, is there something real here? Are animals, are birds really interacting with human environments differently, potentially because we've now slowed our own human activity down? Or is this just an observer effect? Is it just people are noticing things more? And then we, of course, had some other famous stories that turned out not to be true at all because someone had uploaded a video of dolphins in the Venetian canals, which turned out not to be the case at all. And it was a video from somewhere else in Europe. So we really didn't know whether or not birds, especially, were and wildlife more generally had any sort of change in where they were seen and what kind of behaviors they had during the pandemic. And then when you think about human landscapes more broadly, we know that wildlife interact with a landscape like this in lots of different ways, and we know that it affects them. There's obviously massive habitat change that has occurred in this landscape here that I'm showing you, this city. Um, and Western science, we like to tend to separate factors out. And when you think about a landscape like this, there's a lot of habitat change, and we know that that's important. But habitat change at this sort of scale doesn't come by itself. Whenever you build a city like this, that comes along with things like roads, airports, all those things come with activity. You don't just build a giant city full of concrete and then leave it empty and quiet. Whenever you have an area like this, that comes with a lot of noise, that comes with a lot of traffic, a lot of people moving around. And so the question then is, if you want to think about the impact of a change like this, the impact of humans on the landscape, is it only the habitat change that's causing the impact, or does our activity play a role in that? And can we disassociate the effect of our activity from the effect of the habitat change itself? And that's something that would never have been possible to study until the pandemic came along. Because if you would have gone to someone, a funding agency, and said, "Here's an experiment I'd like to run. I would like to take the city of Winnipeg, where I live, and completely shut it down so that the activity goes down to almost zero, and then see what effect that has on wildlife." You would get laughed at naturally because that would be impossible. Um, until it wasn't. And so rather than waste this opportunity, we decided, well, let's use that. And this is a paper that was published really early, that first summer of the pandemic. And these authors termed this period the anthropause, which is an okay term for it. I don't know if I completely like the term pause. It implies something that stopped. Obviously, human activity didn't totally stop, but there certainly was a change, and a large slowing down of activity. Um, and so the question then is, did this affect wildlife? Well, we kind of came at that from this perspective. This was basically the fundamental question we asked. We wanted to know if birds were using areas of lower human activity differently during the pandemic lockdowns in just that period that we defined. Initially, we thought this would be a short, we'd do the study for the period when the pandemic was affecting things, and then things would go back to normal over summer, and then we would move on with our lives. But of course, that didn't happen. But the study we did wound up focusing on that March through May of 2020 period. And we needed to compare that to something. How do we study the effect of the pandemic if we can't compare it to something else? And so we're comparing it to the pre-pandemic, and we picked data from the 3 years prior to the pandemic, 2017 through 2019, that same March through May period. And that was possible because of eBird. Without some sort of baseline data set that we had from 2017 through 2019, we wouldn't have been able to do what we did. And so we used eBird. I'm sure that many of you, I'm not going to really go through what eBird is. All of you are pretty familiar, I think, with eBird and how it works. But we focused on 93 different counties, and all of the counties that we chose to use in our study had fairly large cities in them, and cities that had airports, because we wanted to tease apart the effect of airports specifically. And so we picked and chose, which counties we could use. Unfortunately, I don't think any of the counties in Nova Scotia made our cutoff for what we could include. It's just not as dense a place, for better or worse, I guess. But we did have a number of cities in Canada, and then a lot of counties in the U.S. And we used data from 82 different species, and these were all species that were relatively common within the eBird data, so species that people regularly see. And so then the most obvious question I think that many of you probably have, and certainly a question that I had when I started this was, okay, but my birding habits changed in 2020. How would that affect the results? If what we're studying is the effect of what birders are seeing and not what's actually happening with the wildlife, then that's not telling us what we want to learn. We want to learn something about the wildlife. Some people did actually do, some folks at the Cornell lab, and this is one of the main reasons why I was glad we were talking with them and they were co-authors. They did actually do a paper, which I don't have a link to here, but I could dig it up if you'd like to see it, on how eBird data changed during the pandemic. And there's some interesting results that they found on how the use of eBird changed. But even before that paper was published, we knew that there had to be differences in how people were birding, and therefore we needed to take those into account when we started to look at the data. And so we did that through a couple of ways. The first thing that we did was we filtered out any data from what we termed new users, and that was users who had not reported any eBird. We basically first collected all the eBird checklists from the database that were from March through May for the counties that we had in our study. And then we said if a user submitted data in 2020 but did not submit data from that same county in 2017 through 2019 during that same period, then we weren't going to use that user. So this doesn't necessarily mean that they were data from new birders. For example, I had never been in Winnipeg before 2020, and so any of my data from Winnipeg wouldn't have been counted in this. That was just our way of a really rough way of saying we don't want to use data from people who started birding during the pandemic because we know that previous research has shown that eBird use changes over time, and people detect birds slightly differently once they get used to eBird and once they get used to birding, once they become better birders, for lack of a better term. And that can change in different places. If you're a birder that's really experienced in one place and then you go to the Amazon, you may have a very different rate of detection of birds than someone who's really experienced there. So we wanted to only use data from people who had eBirded those same counties prior to the pandemic. We figured that was a good enough check that it would discount any of this, what we thought might be this large influx in birders and new birders who were just coming to it for the first time. It turns out, actually, after the fact, I don't know that that really affected the results as much. I think that most people that started eBirding, there are plenty of people picked up birding during the pandemic, I think. But I think most of the people that were using eBird, at least the majority of the data, were already. I don't think their bird detection really changed all that much in terms of the eBird data. So we probably could have used those data and been fine. But just to be on the safe side, we didn't use those. And the other thing that we did, which is really important, was we did a geographic subsample of all the checklists that we had available to us. And that was so that the pre-pandemic and pandemic data were distributed equally. And I've got some graphics here that kind of show that in a little bit more detail. So we know that checklists during the pandemic came from different areas. And that was something that was quantified a little bit in that other paper that I mentioned from the Cornell lab. This is just one of our counties. This is just the data that we had for one of our counties, which is, I believe, in Michigan. Yeah, Ingham County, Michigan. So the city of Lansing, Michigan is actually up here in the northwest corner where that red dot is. And what you're seeing here, each of these different hexagons, I've split the area up into these different hexagons here, and the color of the hexagon indicates how many suitable checklists we had. We subsampled, we kind of filtered out checklists in a lot of the standard ways that eBird data are filtered, and when they get used for data, things like distance how far did people travel and what the duration was, and other things that are fairly typical for papers that use eBird data. But then once we had that list of checklists, we went through and said, okay, where are they distributed within each county? And you can see a couple of patterns here. This is a very typical pattern of eBird data where they're concentrated in places with people because people tend to bird around where they live more so than other places. People certainly go and bird in the more rural parts of the county, but there's a lot of data coming from the cities, which is fine. that's okay for this particular project as long as it stays the same. But we know that there were changes in the pandemic. So, if you just take it, doesn't the broad pattern is fairly similar. But if you look at, say, this particular cell here, just to the northeast of the city center, it was relatively lower amounts of checklists compared to the hexagon right below it. And then during the pandemic, it had a more similar number. So this is the number during the pandemic in 2020. you know, uh, Same thing with this cell over here is a little bit darker relative to the others pre-pandemic, and then it's much lighter post-pandemic. And there could be lots of reasons for that. It could be that there's a lot of birders that have yards up in this cell, and if they were birding their yards more often, you tended to get more checklists from that area relative to the others. It could be that there was a particular park that was visited more or less often once the restrictions were in place. Um, and then the other obvious thing is there's fewer checklists in 2020. That makes sense. It's actually pretty equal. It's about one third the checklists you had here, and this is 3 years combined, and this is only 1 year, so that tracks. But of course, when you have fewer checklists, and there are some areas where you have a few checklists in these rural places, and you just don't have data in 2020. And we didn't want to compare apples to oranges and compare a lot of checklists from a marsh from pre-pandemic to a lot of checklists of a backyard during the pandemic, because that doesn't tell us anything about how the birds reacted. That just tells us about where people birded. So our method accounted for a couple of things. What we did is we went through and did this algorithm that sampled which checklists we were going to use, and that resulted in an exact equal number of checklists from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. And so each cell here, basically the map of pre-pandemic checklists and the map of post-pandemic checklists or during pandemic checklists, looks exactly the same for the data that we used. And we still had this issue where you had a lot of data from some areas and less data from others. But because the numbers are equal, that means we have 30 checklists from prior to the pandemic and 30 checklists from during the pandemic for this cell, for example. And maybe we only have 5 checklists from each of those periods for this cell, but at least it's equal. That doesn't necessarily totally account for any particular differences, but at least within this geographic or this spatial scale, it allows you to sample roughly the same habitats equally. The other thing that it does is that it spreads the data out so that we have a little bit more data relatively coming from more rural areas as opposed to all the data coming from the city. So we're not necessarily making in, our interpretations don't have to be related just to that city center. They can be a little bit more broad. And so that was a really important step, and it made, I think, the results a lot more robust. And then finally, the last thing that we did to account for this birder effort is we didn't just focus on whether or not the number of birds changed, because bird numbers can change for lots of reasons. You know this as well as anyone else, that in 1 year you might have a lot of one kind of species and not in another year. That may have something to do with the weather. Keep in mind, we're looking at March through May, so this is migration for most of these areas around North America. And so rather than focus on the absolute number of birds, on the abundance, we instead focused on relationships. We wanted to know, how did birds use areas where human activity changed? And we did that by looking at these 5 different, what we called indices of human activity. So we had data that we were able to say, we think that this particular index gives us a relative measure of how the human activity changed. And by comparing the relationship to each of these, we can look at sort of how the birds responded to those changes. So we had 3 kind of what you could call like land cover or habitat type variables. One was just a basic, what is the immediate land cover around where each checklist was collected? Is it more urban? Is it more rural? Another one is the distance to the nearest major road, and then the distance to the nearest international airport. And so we knew that roads and airports were these centers of human activity. And those were places where we know that things changed during the pandemic. We didn't necessarily know whether or not the human activity in a particular place changed, but we knew that roads tended to decrease, airports tended to decrease in their activity. And then at the sort of larger scale, at the county scale, we had one direct measure of how human activity changed, and that was this data product that Google produced that was publicly available, that just basically used data from people's phones to estimate how active they were being, how much they were moving around. And it's only available at the county level, so it's not really fine scale, but at least it allowed us to compare different counties and say, did this county change a lot in human activity during the pandemic, or did it change relatively little? All of them decreased to some extent, but was it a lot of a change, or a large change, or a smaller change? And then within each county, we knew that birds were hitting these counties at different times of the year. And the peak sort of pandemic lockdown happened in April in 2020. But there are some birds that we wanted to study that would have moved through some of those areas in the south before the pandemic restrictions really took hold. And so we looked at the migration timing, the overlap between the timing of the lockdown and the timing of migration. And I've got a couple of slides on that as well. And so what this looks like, sort of graphically, is if we imagine pre-pandemic birds are coming into an area with people, we may predict that they would favor the areas where there's less activity, maybe those more parks or more rural areas of a county, and so you might see more of them there relative to the city. If you look at what a relationship like that looks like, you might expect something like this. So if you look at one of our indices, the distance to an airport, for example, you may think that the numbers close to the airport might be lower than the numbers far from the airport because the birds are avoiding that airport, because they're avoiding that activity. You can think of that in different terms. You can think, if you translate that to the degree of pandemic related change, close to an airport would have had a lot of change during the pandemic. Far from an airport would have had relatively less change because you're not close to the airport, and so whether or not the airport is dealing with a lot of flights doesn't really change the environment from a bird's perspective if that spot is really far from an airport. And you can do the same thing with roads and with urban areas, for example. Then during 2020, if what we thought was the case would happen, and if birds started using areas differently, we might expect that, okay, now this bird still may show up in those rural areas, but now it's got all this other habitat that is less active, that has less noise, for example. So maybe those numbers in that area are relatively higher, even if the total number of birds hasn't changed. And what that might look like is not necessarily greater or lower numbers of birds, but just a different relationship. And so now there's not as strong a difference between the area with low amount of pandemic change and the area with high amount of pandemic change. And so if the slope of this line, if that relationship has changed, that tells us that there was a change in the bird behavior and the bird activity relative to this index of human activity. And that signals to us an effect of the pandemic. So not necessarily how many there were, but how many there were relative to that index. I'll note at this point, we don't think that what we measured in this particular study was a change in the total numbers of birds related to the pandemic at all. And partly that's because this was the spring of 2020. These birds had bred the year before. They had just overwintered in Central South America. Most of them were moving north on migration. So if we saw lower numbers of birds or higher numbers of birds, it's not because the population had suddenly changed. It was that as those birds were migrating, they were spending their time in different places. I suspect had we been able to study the whole continent, all the rural areas, all the urban areas together, we would have seen a shift, but we wouldn't necessarily see numbers go up or down, just a shift in where they were spending their time. Because we were just focusing on these urban counties, we weren't able to do quite as much of a comparison like that. But so I'm not really talking about total numbers of birds, population changes. What I'm talking about is behavioral changes. So turns out we found some really interesting things. So this is just one example. So here's our lovely ruby-throated hummingbirds. And you can see that, I've picked airport here as an example. This is one case where we saw a change. And the orange line here is the 2017 through 2019, the pre-pandemic relationship. And you can see it's relatively flat. Hummingbirds didn't really care how close they were to airports. They were seen pretty much the same, regardless of the distance to the airport. During the pandemic, people saw a lot more of them close to airports than they did further from airports. And so this is evidence to us that those hummingbirds prior to the pandemic were not using areas near airports the same way that they did during the pandemic, during 2020. So this is an increase in the use of areas near airports. And if we go through all the species that we saw, that we looked at, we see pretty general results. We saw a lot of change, much more than we expected to see. Most of the species we looked at, most of those 82 species, 80% of them showed some change in relationship to at least one of those five indices of human activity. And we had about 3 times as many species that showed increases in areas where the pandemic affected things a lot, those places with reduced human activity, many more increases in relative abundance than decreases. And so a lot of birds were increasing their use of areas where the pandemic had a greater effect. And we saw a large diversity of birds that showed these various responses. So everything from raptors, hawks, and eagles through waterfowl. We didn't have too many waterfowl on our list, but we had a few, and we saw some responses among them, all the way down to plenty of songbirds. And so a few other examples. I'm not going to go through the whole list, obviously, but Canada geese increased their use of areas near roads. American robins likewise increased their use of areas near roads. Someone was mentioning double-crested cormorants earlier. They increased their use of areas near airports. And then it wasn't just increases, as I mentioned. We saw some diversity in responses. Birds like red-tailed hawks actually had a decrease in their use of area near roads. And this is a really interesting case. We're wondering about why that might be. We don't necessarily have a whole lot of information on mechanisms, but here's a bird that we know makes use of roadkill, and they tend to use roads when there's normal human activity as a source of food. So it's possible, I don't have any proof of this, but it's possible that the lack or the decrease in relative abundance of red-tailed hawks near roads could have been the result of them not being as interested in those roads when you didn't have as much roadkill, which presumably happened because of less traffic. So I mentioned migration. Migration is obviously a very important part of these data because of when they were collected, and that overlap between migration timing and pandemic timing. So that might look something like this. This is just a generic graphic, but if you had the peak amount of lockdown sort of in this sort of April through to maybe early to mid May, that was we kind of defined that peak lockdown using the curves from the Google data. And then if we compare that to the bird abundance in that particular county, because each of these mobility data curves are relative to the county, we can calculate what the overlap is between that peak migratory period and that peak overlap period for that species for that particular county. And if you do that for a couple of species, it looks like this. So here's blue-winged teal. Ducks tend to migrate a little bit earlier. So any dot that's colored here is a dot where we had enough data we could use for the model of that species. And the darker purple colors are areas where there was greater overlap. So they were going through sort of the middle part of the continent here when the lockdown was in its greatest peak, sort of when the reduction in human activity was the greatest. That's when the blue-winged teal were mostly moving through this part of the continent. Contrast that to ruby-throated hummingbird, and during that April period when the lockdowns were the most severe, where the decrease in human activity was the greatest, the ruby-throated hummingbirds were really moving through the southern part of their range at that point. They didn't really get up to the northern part of their range until a little bit later in the season. And so this gave us another index that we could use as one of those 5 indices. And it turns out that this was actually a really important one. So the blue-winged teal, for example, that I just showed, they had they were counted much more. They were recorded much more in areas where the overlap was stronger, which tells us that the response was not just an effect over the whole year. It was mostly being seen during that peak that peak overlap when the bird numbers when the birds were going through the areas with the strongest lockdowns. So that was more evidence for effects of the pandemic on birds. There were some birds that didn't show any effect of the pandemic. Now, this could be because we just didn't have enough data, or because the effect was so subtle that the eBird data weren't able to really discern that. But it is notable. So I say that because it's hard to it's hard to make inferences on something where you don't see a relationship with statistics like this. It could be there could be a relationship there that we just weren't able to see. But I do think it's notable how many of the introduced, city birds that we normally think of as common urban city birds were on this list of species that did not see any relationship whatsoever. House sparrows and rock pigeons were probably the two most obvious examples of that, but things like house wrens as well, and a few others that are um, really common city birds that didn't show relationships. It wasn't all of them. Obviously, I showed pictures of Canada goose and American robin. Those birds are also things I would normally associate with, at least suburban, certainly urban areas. And they did show responses. But it's interesting that things like the rock pigeon and the house sparrow didn't. I think that adds another element to our results that's interesting to think about. So ultimately, I think we learned a number of really important things. The first and probably most important is that human activity is important. It's not just the fact that we change habitat, but it's that we occupy that habitat and we inject that habitat with traffic and noise and all the other things that we changed during the pandemic. And our activity is important to birds and to wildlife. I think that that's a really important piece that we need to think about when we think about
That's the question.
our impact on wildlife. The other thing that I think is really interesting about these data is how quickly birds responded to this change. We started the pandemic lockdowns in mid-March. A few weeks later, these cities were shut down like this, and those birds had started their migration before we had even started locking down. So it was really, really rapid. Birds showed up in an area and they were using those areas differently than they had used in past years. They didn't have, weeks or months to, realize that these areas were different, to arrive in a place where they had arrived before and then move to other areas. These are birds that are moving relatively quickly through a lot of these places. They may only spend a few days in a city like this before they move on and migrate north. And so they were reacting almost instantly to the change in environment, which I think is really remarkable and speaks to how adaptable a lot of birds are to conditions. As soon as we dialed down our activity, we saw a response on a large continental scale. And then, sort of, the third point here is that there are different responses for different species. And so we can't just make a blanket statement. I mean, I have already, sort of, because we saw a large number of birds that saw increases in areas with lower amounts of activity, but it's not the same for every species. And there are some species that showed only decreases in activity. There are some species that didn't show any response at all. And so every single different kind of bird may react to human activity differently. And the other thing is that we saw a lot of species that had a response in one of those indices but not others, or even differences. So red-tailed hawks, for example, they decreased the amount of time or whatever exactly changed about it. They decreased their use of areas near roads. And I'm not actually remembering exactly what the red-tailed hawks did, but I'm pretty sure that they increased their use of areas that changed in the pandemic in other ways. It might have been the urban-rural aspect. So they might have been using urban spaces more, but using areas near roads less. And so each species had its own unique response. That's kind of the takeaway. And so if we're thinking about how our activity affects birds, we can't necessarily make a blanket statement about all birds. We need to think about how does our activity affect this bird, this particular species. But I think it's worth emphasizing that first point, that our activity, it's not just the habitat change, it's not just the fact that we built a city, it's the fact that we occupy that city and we change our use of that city that affects birds. The habitat will always have an important part. Obviously, this level of landscape change is going to affect birds in some way, but the activity is a component of that. And we can't just think about a city as just the landscape change. We need to think of our activity as well. This does raise another caveat for our particular study, which is that we can't say that 2020 was better for birds, even though a lot more of them were using human areas more. It's possible that it was better because it opened up habitat that had been closed off to a lot of birds in the past, but that habitat was affected by a lot of things that did not change during the pandemic. Introduced predators like cats, They were just as abundant during the pandemic. In fact, maybe even more abundant during the pandemic as before. A lot of our pollution, there is some evidence that some pollution in some parts of the world changed during the peak lockdowns, but other kinds of pollution went up. Other kinds didn't change at all. Um, the climate is still changing, and that didn't really change at all during the pandemic. And then buildings, we just heard about window collisions, and window collisions were certainly something, especially if birds were using urban areas more, window collisions may have gone up during 2020. So we can't necessarily say that it was better for birds. We can say that they used those spaces differently. And I think the big key to understanding how we can learn from this and make places better for birds is by understanding the mechanisms. We weren't able to say with our study whether or not what aspect of the human activity most affected the birds. And it could be different for different species. You know, a robin like this might have reacted to noise. It might be normally avoiding roads because of the noise, and it can't hear its other robins in the vicinity. It can't keep an ear out for predators as well. Maybe it's the activity itself. Maybe robins react to people and cars moving back and forth, and once you change that activity, you result in a change in the behavior of the bird. It could be something like predators or food. We know that the pandemic probably affected more than just birds. It may have affected raccoons. It may have affected coyotes, other predators. It may have affected those cats that are predators of birds. And so, and it could have affected their food supply. You know, it could have affected insects or I don't know if it affected plants very much. There's probably too fast for that, but there are certainly a lot of reasons why things during the pandemic may have shifted, and that could have resulted in the change that these birds exhibited as well. Until we were able to tease apart those mechanisms, we're not going to be able to really fully understand how we can use this information to our benefit. So we really need to, I think, study some of those mechanisms more. Fortunately, I don't think we necessarily need to repeat a pandemic in order to study that. There's lots of ways that you can do experimental studies that are probably going to be actually more effective than using eBird data on a grand continental scale to tease apart some of these mechanisms that are probably at play here. But once we do, I think that means that we can then be a little bit more careful about how we make urban spaces more attractive to birds. So if we're imagining a city of the future where we want to make that a wildlife friendly place and we want to live in and among wildlife in cities and also more suburban and rural areas, we can consider how our activity needs to adapt in order to make that space a better place for birds. Some other important lessons I think from this work is obviously the value of citizen science data like eBird. Uh, we would not have been able to do this if we didn't have baseline data from before the pandemic, and we wouldn't have been able to say, oh, in 3 years we're going to have this massive unplanned experiment where we're going to shut cities down, so let's start collecting bird data in cities. Had we done that, we would have been able to design a study where we could actually tease apart those mechanisms. But having programs like eBird, like iNaturalist, that allow us to sample biodiversity at a baseline level so that when something happens, we're able to use that baseline data to be able to say something about what has just happened. That's a really, really valuable thing. And we were able to do it across the whole continent, which would never have been possible with sort of the traditional way to think about science. So citizen science data, it can be extraordinarily valuable, but it also has limits. We saw that there were lots of things about data collection that changed during the pandemic. And so we needed to think carefully about how we used those data. And they can't be used for everything. We weren't able to tease apart all the different mechanisms because there are just limits to what eBird data can tell us. And we need to be able to accept that and understand that. It also tells us that the importance of not jumping to conclusions. We had all those anecdotal reports and those incidental observations early in the pandemic. Rather than sort of claim that the pandemic has suddenly been amazing for wildlife or terrible for wildlife, it was important to look at that carefully from a quantitative perspective, from a scientific perspective. But there is a role in those anecdotal observations. We never would have even thought about doing this had people not been reporting weird things and noticing things that they hadn't noticed before. So it's those anecdotal observations that give us the seed, that give us the inspiration and the motivation for doing some of these studies, and then we can apply the science that we carefully learn and practice to those questions, those hypotheses. And then finally, this study was really just about one part of the world, and the pandemic being so global, there's a lot to learn from a lot of different places. And in fact, there have been a few conferences that I've been a part of in the last couple of years where we started to pull people together that have actually done similar things in different parts of the world, and been able to see some similarities and some differences. And so there's a lot more to learn about how the pandemic affected things differently in different parts of the world, where lockdowns were done very differently. Europe had very different styles of lockdowns than North America did, and so it's interesting to kind of do those comparisons. If you'd like to learn more, I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading the paper itself for the layperson. There's a lot of really technical jargon in there. It's designed for scientists, but if you're interested, you're more than welcome to look at the paper itself. It's open access, so you should be able to access it through that link. Or I can send Diana a PDF if she wants to send that around to the group. And then, of course, you're more than welcome to contact us. Actually, I'll give you a different email because that email is probably going to go away soon. That still works in my Manitoba email, but there's other email addresses that will work into the future. And then Nikki Coper is another person who's still here at the University of Manitoba and has now moved on to some of our other stuff, but we still have this ear to the ground for things that are happening in relation to the pandemic effects on wildlife. And then that working group there, that website is sort of the working group that pools together our collective sort of expertise. There's a lot of different people, not only studying birds, but studying mammals and reptiles and how the pandemic affected lots of different kinds of wildlife. And a lot of the different projects are linked to on that website. So you're welcome to look at that and learn a little bit more. So that's all I have right now, and I am happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. That's really interesting. I was especially impressed with the methods, and I can imagine the conversations behind the scenes that led you to those. It must have been a really interesting to get to the point where you were able to find those factors that you could hold constant as to the extent that you could. It took a lot of work and
Yeah,
a lot of imagination to come up with that, I imagine.
yeah. It's really interesting there was a lot. I did a lot of work that summer
I bet you did.
to understand how to use eBird data. Using eBird data is actually kind of tricky because of how many data there are. There are so many data in the database that you need to have some um, pretty advanced skills in data management to be able to actually just work with them in the first place. Uh, when you're collecting data at that continental scale, it's a little bit better if you're just focusing on one area, one region, one province, something like that. But certainly at the continental scale like that, we're talking about data objects that are gigabytes in size, and so it can be really challenging. And then, yeah, teasing apart the statistics and figuring out how are we going to ask this question in a way that the eBird data will allow us to answer. And we knew that there were certain aspects of the data that were not held constant, and we just needed to account for those and find a way to do that. So it was challenging, but I think ultimately I'm really happy with how it turned out.
I'm really happy that when CBC called me, I had the good sense to say I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't think I could be helpful,
And it
because
took us a year and a half basically until we were comfortable enough with our answer as well.
yeah. If people, if you folks, if you could raise your hands if you have a question. Chris, I see you have a question. I'm just going to read one from the chat section first. And David McCorkdale asked about a decrease in activity near airports. He wondered if species such as starlings and crows were less frequently observed near airports.
That is a great question, and I do not remember off the top of my head, but I can go to the figure and get you the answer right now because it's a I put the work in. I might as well look it up. We
Yeah,
did definitely American Crow was definitely one of the models we ran, and Starling was the other one. I'm
yeah.
sure that I can't imagine we didn't run European Starling. Um, Figures. which figure was it? Figure 3, I think. In fact, I can probably share my screen and show you the figure from the paper. That might be fun. Let's
Sure.
pull up figure 2. Okay, so let's do that. So this is a relatively, so this is the figure from the paper that just sort of summarized, did we see, am I sharing the screen? No, not yet.
Not yet, no.
I didn't click OK, apparently. There we
There
go.
we go.
So this is the figure from the paper where we basically just said, we didn't look at how much of an increase there was. Was there an increase in areas with greater reduction in human activity, or was there a decrease, or both? If we're looking at sort of these collectives, so these are the 5 indices here, and then this is we split those indices into those top 3, which were kind of within county indices, and then the ultimate change in traffic and that overlap index, which were among counties. So the question was on, were the European starling and American crow. Okay, so American crow, the only index where American crow reacted was the overlap, the migration overlap. So that did not see any relationship, positive or negative, to airport. And European starling, where is European starling?
You had it. It was just at the top of the screen there, right-hand column.
Here it is. Yes, European starlings did increase around airports.
Huh.
But they decreased in areas with more. That's actually interesting because very few species saw a decrease in areas with greater overlap, and we weren't really sure exactly what to make of that.
Yeah.
But they did seem to, they were seen more in areas near airports during 2020. Yep. Anyway, this is all the results. And if you want to take a closer look at this, you're welcome to click on the paper. It's in the paper.
Natalie also asked about the red-tailed hawk activity, which I think is a kind of a neat hypothesis, which is that she asked if the red-tailed hawk activity decrease could be due to fewer rodents near roads as a result of lower human activity, like, for example, less garbage around.
That's certainly a valid hypothesis, and I would have no way of knowing with the data that we had, but yeah, something about roads caused there to be fewer red-tailed hawks during the pandemic, during 2020, near roads.
Yeah.
And what exactly that was is difficult to say. It's possible that they were attracted more to other places. And there's only so many red-tailed hawks in the world, and if they're not in one place, they're going to be in another place. So it's possible that it wasn't really an effect of the road itself, but an effect of somewhere else, and they just changed where they were spending most of their time. But given how red-tailed hawks feed, and given what their prey are, and how drawn they are to roads for lots of those reasons, I would not be surprised if there was something food related that caused them to not be near roads during the pandemic.
Chris, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, more a comment. I wondered, an interesting places to look at this would be a couple of cities in Australia. Melbourne was absolutely rigid in their lockdowns, and very severe lockdowns for quite a period of time. Sydney, on the other hand, which is a fairly comparable city in terms of habitat and things like that, did not have nearly as severe lockdowns. The birds common there would be not so different. Brisbane probably had even less of a lockdown. So, it might be there you would get a sense of whether the severity of the lockdown did it, because you just treated all lockdowns as equal in a sense.
To some extent, yes. We did have that Google data that was able to distinguish among different counties, and so we were able to that particular factor allowed us to say the lockdown was stronger in this county versus that county.
Yeah.
But you're right that the level of difference in North America, it was relatively minor. Some counties were slightly more stringent than others. I think it's also important to note that what we're looking at is not necessarily the how stringent the lockdown was, like how stringent the laws were. What we're looking at is the actual activity, is how people moved around. So if there was a stringent law that forced people to move around less, then obviously that would be seen in the movement data. But there were plenty of places where the law was, in the U.S. especially, most U.S. cities didn't actually have particularly stringent lockdowns. You were still allowed to do whatever you wanted in many places, but the the actual human activity still showed a relatively strong response because people voluntarily stayed home, especially during those initial few months.
Yeah.
Um, I do think that there are many places around the world where you have a much greater difference in those kinds of lockdowns, and I was not aware of the differences among Australian cities. That's a really interesting potential avenue. And the nice thing about that is I think Australia actually has a decent amount of eBird data. There's some places in the world where eBird is not as popular, and we just
Mhm.
wouldn't have the level of data that we have in North America. Australia actually does have a decent amount of eBird data, at least from the past few years. So that could be a potential place where we could look as well. Um, I think that I don't know if there was anyone from Australia who was already looking at that. I don't think so. But there are some people in different parts of the world. We have some collaborators in the UK, and actually I'm a co-author on a paper that we're working on right now, where we looked at some data from the UK, which also had relatively strict lockdowns, much stricter than in North America. And there we saw some other really interesting differences. Although obviously the bird communities in the UK are very different and have been interacting with humans in a very different way for much longer than North America. So I think there are some really interesting geographic differences and human activity differences around the world that could lead to a lot more research. There's probably a couple PhDs worth of research that could be done on this topic.
Um, s- Speaking of co-authors, David McCorkdale wondered if there A.G. Horn was our Andy Horn from Dalhousie University.
Yes,
Yeah, cool.
yes, he was. He didn't play a huge role, but he did offer some really valuable insights, especially in relation to activity and noise. I think that he's done a lot of work on that. And so, yeah, he was one of the co-authors that helped us edit the paper and offered some valuable suggestions. Yep.
Angie Millard has an interesting question about young, whether or not you were able to study or notice any increase in the survival of young that fledged during COVID.
And the short answer to that is no, but I would love to. So our study was really just using data from March through May. So it was prior to the breeding season. I guess there's some of these birds in the southern part of the range that maybe they would have started breeding already by May, but we definitely weren't really looking at changes during the period when you would expect to see an actual change in population or any effective survival. And I think that there are ways to do that. You could potentially look at data from the fall and compare numbers. The folks at Cornell have thought long and hard about how to actually use eBird data to look at changes in population and status and trends. And that is a hot topic of research right now that I'm learning now that I'm starting working at Cornell and starting to sit down on meetings with folks. There there are a lot of challenges to using eBird data for that purpose, and a lot of thought that has to go into doing that because of all the various ways that eBird data can be noisy for answering some of those questions. But it's possible. I think there's a lot of other data that could be used as well. Unfortunately, a lot of banding programs, a lot of the map stations and things that do bird banding were not operating the way they normally do during the pandemic, which really hurts because it meant we weren't able to collect a lot of that data, things like the relative number of juveniles or their body condition that you would normally get from bird banding stations. So I think that there are a lot of questions out there. Only some of those questions there are going to be questions that you could actually answer with the data that we have. But there are probably some clever ways of using eBird data or using what other scientific data are out there on birds in different places to try and get a handle on that. I don't know that we're ever really going to get a satisfactory answer on a broad scale, on this large continental scale, for this number of species. But you might be able to do some more targeted studies for species that you do have better data for, where you can make some more valid assumptions about how the birds were reacting. Yeah, the shorter answer is I have no idea if birds would have fledged young better. We did in our paper. We did talk about one potential thing, which was ecological traps, is the ecological term, the scientific term for it, where you have a species that is drawn to an area because it seems like a good area, but it turns out to have some factor that means it's bad. For example, if these birds were attracted to cities that seemed like nice natural areas because of the lack of noise, but then were subject to really high levels of collision mortality or predator mortality, that would be an example of an ecological trap. And it's entirely possible that birds began breeding in areas that later on in the summer, when things started to open up a little bit more and became noisier, turned out not to be very good areas, or or saw greater levels of predation and lower survival because of that, lower juvenile survival. It's really difficult to know without looking at the data.
Harry Colgan wanted to know if you had any data showing any response to sound or noise in the environment.
I mean, I suspect that a lot of those colored squares were the result of noise. I think noise is probably the mechanism that is most plausible for why a bird would react so quickly to a change in the environment like this.
Huh.
Because birds rely on sound for so much of what they do, and it's such a telling characteristic of human activity. And a lot of our co-authors have done a lot of work on noise, Dr. Coper included, and so that was the perspective they were coming from as well. We just don't have the data to really say for sure, because we can't necessarily disassociate the noise from the activity. If the pandemic activity went down, that means there were fewer cars and less noise, and we don't necessarily have ways of controlling for that and saying here's an area with lots of activity but little noise, or little activity but lots of noise. You'd have to do that experimentally, I think, or find a factor where the noise and the activity were different or changed differently, and were actually measured in different ways. And unfortunately, we weren't able to find any way of measuring that, so that we could include that in our models. But
Yeah.
um,
And
but
especially,
it's an interesting question, and I if I had to put money on it, I think noise is probably a really important aspect of why we saw a lot of these changes, but probably not all of them.
right. And so, like you said, there's experiments that could be done and maybe that have been done around noise that can inform those kinds of underlying mechanisms. Yuli had a question. Yuli, would you like to take yourself off mute, please?
Yeah, it's more a thought that went through my head than an actual question. I mean, birds, unlike other wildlife, of course, are a lot more mobile, able to move a lot quicker on short notice into habitat or an environment that opens up, becomes more accessible to them. And at the same time, of course, if the conditions change, they are just as quick to move elsewhere due to the ability to fly. So, I mean, and the whole COVID restrictions and the results of that were, of course, quite transient periods of time.
Mhm.
I mean, even here in Nova Scotia, I mean, how long did the lockdown at the beginning of the pandemic last while parks were basically shut down before they opened up? And then, of course, people started using them even more because they had no other place to go. So I, I doubted that there will be long-term effects on bird populations because it was just a snap of time in their life. Just hopefully it will be in ours.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I don't think that our study says much about the long term. I don't think that when we look back on it, we're going to say, oh, COVID was a really important moment in bird populations or in the lives of North American birds. Um, I think what it does is it teaches us something about our activity. And if we can use that to our advantage and make changes to how we use urban spaces and maybe design roads and airports differently so that if it's noise, for example, we can cut down on that level of noise, then it gives us an opportunity to make things that will have long-term effects. So if we can learn what was about COVID that actually caused these changes, these temporary changes, then maybe we can use that knowledge to better design our urban spaces in the future.
And that would be the practical implication, at least one of them. I don't see any other questions from folks. Any last, either in the lineup here? I know Yuli did ask a question earlier, which I think you answered, and didn't specifically, but he was mentioning roadkill as one of the reasons why red-tailed hawks would be.
Yeah, it was more an idea that came up to the previous questions because
Sure.
obviously a lot of the raptors that hang out along the roadside are looking for an easy meal, and of course, less traffic means less roadkill. And then, of course, they have to move somewhere else where they have a better chance finding that. So,
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you once again, Michael. It was a really interesting presentation, and I'll give CBC your number.
I think they were when we did quite a lot of drum beating when the paper came out, and I think CBC had a couple of talks with us. So I
I'm
was
sure they did.
more with Nikki. I was actually traveling at that point. I was
Yeah.
finally visiting the U.S. again after a year and a half of not seeing my family. So so there was some press when the paper came out.
Yeah, yeah. And so where's your next stop? Or you have a trip in the future?
Yeah, so I mentioned, so I'm working with the Cornell lab now, and I'm going to be working on eBird data again, but this time, a lot of my PhD work was done in the Southern Ocean, in the Antarctic, and eBird data have been used quite a lot for land birds. To my knowledge, there haven't been any studies that have used eBird data to look at seabirds, at least on the ocean. Perhaps some shorebirds and stuff, but seabirds are a different story, and partly that's because we just don't have a lot of data from the open ocean areas. It's pretty sparse. But if you go to the eBird map and open it up and show where all the data is collected, there's some areas of the ocean that are covered pretty well, and the Southern Ocean is actually one of them because of the tourist activity down there. And so the goal of this project is to collect some extra information to understand how eBird checklists vary, how detection varies, and compare it to some more traditional scientific types of surveys for seabirds on ships. And so I will be doing some work in partnership with Viking Cruises over the next couple of years, and stay tuned for more info on that. But hopefully we'll be able to start to use eBird data at sea in a way that we haven't before. And that's sort of my next adventure, which involved some more trips down to the Antarctic this year and probably more next year.
You may be interested to know, I'm pretty sure we had a yellow-nosed albatross off the coast of Nova Scotia that counted as an. Alex will correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was a yellow-nosed albatross.
I'll
We have
look at the eBird records.
yeah. So yeah, keep your eyes open around the coast of Nova Scotia. We have some pretty good pelagic trips, and also the I think that might have been a cruise ship that went by and saw that boat, or maybe might have been a fishing boat.
Awesome.
Yeah, we have quite a few fishing boats too that go just to the bank. So
yeah, if anyone is interested, Nova Scotia is definitely a great place. Actually, some of my first eBird seabirds were actually in Nova Scotia waters, because that's when I started birding, was in college, and I did an off-campus trip that took me on a sailing school ship around, and one of the places we visited was Lunenburg, which was quite fun. That was my first, and I think to date only time to Nova Scotia. Yeah, that was really fantastic. And if anyone is very keen on collecting data at sea, either relatively near shore, as long as you're sort of a few miles from shore, there's the pelagic protocol, which is really not any different. It's just a traveling count on the water that we want you to keep to a relatively short time frame. But yeah, if you're interested in collecting data at sea, especially more open ocean transects, give me a ring, send me an email. I'm actually the data reviewer for if you get more than 200 nautical miles from shore, your checklists get reviewed by me. So I am happy to chat about some of the weird oddities of eBird data out there on ships, which is different for lots of reasons, and some frustrating ones that make it difficult for us to have accurate filters and things like that. But I'm happy to chat either in advance of a trip or after you get back about your eBird data and about how best to collect that data in a way that'll be most useful to the stuff that I'd like to do.
Great. Eric, did you want to make a comment or a question here?
Yeah, just vis-a-vis yellow-nosed albatross. There are at least a couple of records, and one of them was actually over Seal Island.
Oh,
So that was a land-based record.
nice, nice. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, I would not be surprised if people get in touch about pelagic and data collection. I know that there's already some expertise around eBird, and I'm sure people have done some digging in to figure out. When I've gone on short pelagic trips, you know, I know that the people who are doing the data collection are pretty careful about the GPS readings and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and that was one of the first things that when I started reviewing for them that we really tried to make better was getting good, accurate positions instead of just saying, well, I was in the North Atlantic and putting a pin down somewhere,
Right.
getting good GPS positions. The app has helped quite a bit with that, but there's still a lot more we can do and a lot more data we can collect. And yeah, I'm happy to. In fact, it's possible you've gotten an email from me in the past about your pelagic
Okay,
data
great.
if you've been out past the territorial waters. But yeah, I'm more than happy to chat if anyone wants to get in touch with me about this work or about the seabird stuff.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great evening, everyone. We'll see you next month.